Hi everybody, and welcome back to another behind the scenes process video. I want to start off this video by acknowledging that a lot of the past videos I've done have had a very rigid and formal feeling. I think a lot of that comes from how I've been doing the voiceovers. In the past, I have been writing out a full script that I read pretty much verbatim for these videos, and I think that gives my voice and just kind of my reading a bit of a robotic sound. So for this video, we're going to try a new voiceover style where I've just written out key bullet points and then I'll just speak over that a little more freeform, a little more loose, a little less formal. So for this month's art, I wanted to continue developing the mixed media styles and processes that I used on the pigeon for last month's piece, and I wanted to keep using birds because they are really great subjects for mixed media work. They have a lot of interesting colors and patterns, and that lends to a really easy subject to explore with multiple media at the same time. So if we're sticking with birds, it really seems like crows are a no-brainer. Kind of a cult classic, people just love crows. They're sassy, they're smart, and I especially love this reference that I found on Unsplash, which, if you guys don't know, is a great resource for finding royalty-free images. And I just love the way this guy is marching around, so I figured he'd be great for this month's piece. So I started out this piece by drawing in the form of the crow with pencil on my Arches oil paper, which has quickly become one of my favorite mediums to work on. It's great for mixed media, specifically because it's really porous, it's paper, so you can get cool watercolor effects. You can use colored pencils on it, you can use pastels, and you can even use things like oil paints without priming the paper first. It's really, really life-changing, honestly. With the outline drawn in pencil, I grabbed my handy dandy Caran Neocolor II water-soluble wax pastels. I really love using these to get watercolor textures because I'm able to draw in where I want certain values and colors, and then once I activate it with water, I get these cool, pools of murky colors with a nice bold and natural outline, and I really like that look, especially for these pieces, so these guys were kind of a no-brainer to work with. So like I said, I put in the general values in grayscale first, and this allows me to ensure that I have the appropriate amount of depth throughout the image. Once the grayscale and values are all put in, I'll go back over with my colors, and specifically for this piece I wanted to use kind of a dreamy palette, so lots of blues and purples, little splashes of pink every once in a while. Once all the colors and values are drawn in with the water-soluble wax pastel, it's time for me to go back with my brush pen that has water in the handle so I can squeeze it to get more water out. It allows me to really easily control the flow of water, go back and activate the drawing, and get those cool bleeds and pools of color that I was just talking about. So just like with the pigeon, I took a fatter watercolor brush and wet that down, and then actually went around the outside of the crow to wet where I wanted the pigment from the water-soluble wax pastel that I put down in the crow to bleed out past the form of the crow. How many times can I say crow? Crow. So when I was painting in the watercolor bleeds for the pigeon in last month's art, I wanted the clouds to be kind of directionless, pretty free form, without real focus of any kind. That kind of aimless meandering felt really right for a pigeon. However, for this month's crow, I wanted the clouds to have a little more quote-unquote intention behind them, be a little more focused, have a little more direction, a little more contained than with the pigeon. And I think that's just because crows are more put together than pigeons, and I wanted to depict a more intentional version of the sensation of being aimless and feeling aimless. For these bird pieces that I've done this year, I have struggled a bit when activating the wax pastel drawing with water because I draw it in with the wax pastel pretty close to the reference image in terms of value and color. And so if I activate that drawing without allowing the water to run and bleed into the things next to it, I'll end up with something that is so close to the reference that it doesn't really need too much work on top of it. And I really want the top layer of pastel and colored pencil to add something to it and to not just clutter things and do it for the sake of doing it. So I want to mix staying true to the reference below while also allowing it to bleed. And I'm not sure exactly that I figured it out entirely, but I'm getting a little closer. Once the water and this watercolor layer had all dried, it was time to go back in with my pastels and colored pencils to really define the form and give it that extra level of personality. I wanted to continue the intentionality and the quote-unquote put-togetherness of crows in comparison to pigeons by using a lot of smaller, more directional mark making. I was thinking more kind of just like vertical lines that would phase in the form of the crow than the mix of broad and slim marks going in every direction that I used on the pigeon. Unfortunately, that approach ended up really not working for me. I was pulling my hair out and punching my desk and just losing it by the end of day one trying to make that happen. And that's because I quickly found that too few marks made the depth and definition of the bird too confusing, and too many small marks made it way too busy and you still couldn't really tell what was going on. So I spent pretty much an entire day just adjusting the head and face features until I finally got so fed up on the forehead that I just went back in with a big mark of kind of middle blue and just did something bold and drastic and ended up setting the stylistic tone for the rest of the piece, adopting, after all, an approach really similar to what I used in last month's pigeon piece. So while I'm going through and putting in this top layer, there's kind of a series of decision making that I go through. And first things first, when I'm looking at an area and comparing that to the reference, I try to see what the delta is there and essentially if that under painting layer with the watercolor effect is enough to resemble the reference in color and in depth, then I really try to leave that be and not put anything on top of it. And of course, by depth, I mean value. When it's dark or light enough, I try to leave it without adjusting it with the pastels or colored pencil. If I decide that an area of the underpainting with that watercolor texture isn't enough to accurately represent the reference, I'll try to first put down a large gestural mark whenever possible. I work this way because I like to use as few marks as possible, so if I'm able to define an area with one larger gestural mark instead of a bunch of smaller ones, I'll usually try to do that. This helps me from overworking different areas, which I have a tendency to do, to just kind of fixate on an area and work it until I've done too much. So if I'm able to use less is more, then I will. That said, sometimes it's not enough, and I will have to go back in with smaller lines and shapes of color over top of these big gestural marks or just over top of the watercolor underneath. And one of the things that I really love about mixed media the most is that it kind of forces me to be really creative with my mark making and really look at new ways of representing the reference image through little abstract forms of shapes and colors, and not just perfectly emulating it, but finding the closest facsimile with the mediums that I have. I think for a while now, a couple years, I have been kind of challenging myself to come up with interesting and novel ways of representing imagery using bold colors straight out of the tube, quote unquote, or essentially without mixing colors, and this has forced me to be really creative about my mark making and about the color choices that I use and how they're combined together, put next to each other. And I think that this has really led me to my current approach of creating representation out of a bunch of small abstract elements. Much of the past year has felt like walking through a daydream. Not always pleasant, and with a high level of surreal and unbelievability to the quotidian. And I wanted the crow in its dreamy palette to embody some of this element. Maybe less of the unpleasantness, but still that sense of kind of wandering through something that is part real and part dream. The crow has intention and momentum behind him, but with no clear destination, just kind of wandering to see what's out there. So I figured that Wander would be a good title for the piece. And in that way, the crow becomes a nice reminder that it's okay to lack clarity sometimes. And while it's cliche, it's just as much about the journey as it is the destination, and also being as smart and sassy as possible at all times. And that wraps it up for us. Thanks again for being a patron and supporting my work if you're seeing this in February, or for tuning in the summer if you're seeing this just on my YouTube channel. I really appreciate your support, and please let me know if you like this new voiceover format. If you have any feedback, please reach out. I want to make these videos as engaging as possible for you. Alright, thanks again. Bye.